Right. All right. Hello, everybody. We are coming in this week for our next video revolving around a topic that has to deal with the World War I era. Now, this is a topic that's actually going to be a little bit extensive in terms of we're going to have to split it up into at least 3 videos, maybe 4 if it comes to that. But this is definitely, it's related to World War I because it comes out of it. But this is a topic that really has a major impact on the rest of the 20th century in large part, and that is the Russian Revolution, which is perhaps one of the largest impacts of World War I on the entire 20th century, is because of what eventually comes out of the Russian Revolution, which, if most of us know, the Soviet Union eventually is going to come out of this. This was the death of monarchical imperial Russia, with the emperor or the Tsar at the head of the government, with Russia having a monarchy, and it turns into a bloody revolution that first turns somewhat democratic, and then only for that to be dashed by a communist uprising that eventually coalesces into the Soviet Union a couple years down the road. So for this topic, this is one that we've in the past alluded to in some videos, but we've never covered it directly. I think one of my very first ones I ever did was the 1905 revolution in Russia, which was not successful ultimately. It did get a couple reforms in, but ultimately it wasn't successful because as soon as the Tsar gave the reforms that the people had demanded, he immediately did everything that he could to either revoke those reforms or to weaken them substantially, so as it really was just a show core. It was really just a show reform. It wasn't going to have any actual effect on his rule. But for the topic of today, for the first video here, we're going to cover strictly the February Revolution, because when we're talking about the Russian Revolution, we're really talking about 2 revolutions that happened within the same year. February 1917, because Russia is, or March, it depends on which calendar you're going by, because prior to the Russian Revolution, Russia was still using the old Julian-style calendar that most other European or Western nations had gotten rid of back in the 18th century, like 1700s. So Russia's still using an outdated calendar that's roughly 20 or so days behind everyone else at that point. The same reason why, the whole debacle with, we celebrate George Washington's birthday on the 22nd of February, even though when he was born, Britain was still using the Julian calendar, so were the colonies. So when he was born, it was a different date, a little earlier in February. But the first revolution that we're going to discuss is about March 1917. We call it usually the February Revolution because we're going to use how Russia calls it. And that is going to be the first one we're going to cover, because this is the one that the monarchy comes to an end. That is the first part we have to address. Then in the second one I'm looking at, we'll do the next video that will be covering the October or / November Revolution, and that is where the provisional government that is set up at the end of the February-March Revolution to kind of start forming a democratic government for Russia and maintain power, they get overthrown by the Communist Bolshevik Party, which is, of course, led by the more than infamous Vladimir Lenin. And that eventually is going to coalesce into a civil war, which would be our third video, and then the Soviet Union eventually, long and behold, comes out of that. But for today, we're going to strictly focus on that first revolution that occurs in February or March of 1917, and to start even going into that, the one big thing that is probably provoked this revolution's outbreak more than any other was World War I, in large respect. Mind you, it also had to do with how the Tsar ruled Russia, because let's make one thing very clear. Russia's monarchy was not a constitutional monarchy. It was not like Great Britain or Spain. It was not a monarchy where the ruler didn't have that much power. This was a monarchy where the government had little say except for what the emperor or Tsar gave them. This was an autocratic monarchy. This was the absolute power. This Russia, in many ways, was very similar to the aspect of monarchy in Germany and to the aspect of monarchy in Austria-Hungary. It was an absolute monarchy. What the Tsar said was law, Nobody could challenge that, and if you even tried to challenge it, you would usually see some kind of punishment from the state brought down upon you. But World War One, but that had existed for decades, and that's part of what had spawned the 1905 revolution. The people never really got over the factor that they just still didn't get what they wanted in 1905, but they bit their tongue for a while because they realized we got something, but yeah, it just was not all Russians were satisfied. World War I comes about in 1914 when Russia ends up declaring war upon Austria-Hungary for after it had declared war on Serbia, and then that also brings Germany into the fold and France and a whole domino effect there. But in August of 1914, Russia starts mobilizing for war. Now, according to, and we're going to delve a little bit here into the military aspect, the Russians had perhaps the biggest army of World War I. If I remember right, they could call upon roughly 12 million soldiers at the start of World War I. That beat even the Germans. And that was part of the reason why Germany rushed to attack France first was they figured, okay, France is going to have a smaller army, but they also knew Russia was not a heavily industrialized nation. The Industrial Revolution had just only recently really begun to modernize Russia. Russia had been much slower to hit the Industrial Revolution than other nations. It didn't have the best railways. It didn't have the best modern factories to produce war materials and, equipment and clothes. Russia was very much lagging behind a little bit. So now we're going to go into this modern war. Germany initially had attacked France first as part of its war plan, thinking if we can knock France out in about before 6 weeks, because they figured although Russia has this 12 million man army, it's going to take them a little while to get that fully mobilized into our border. So we have a brief window of opportunity here to prevent a two-front war. We will attack France first, take Paris in like 6 weeks. France will surrender, they'll capitulate. Then we can shift all of our forces to the east so that when Russia finally is fully mobilized and getting ready to go on the offensive, we don't have to worry about France at our back and we can shove everything at the Russians. And back at home in Russia, the people at first are enthusiastic about the war because this they see as helping their fellow Slavs in the Balkans. So at first, the Russian populace is actually supportive of the government going to war with Germany and Austria-Hungary. They're actually supportive of the Tsar at first. This is 1914. This is before the bad things end up kicking in. However, in 1904 to 1905, Russia had just been beaten by Japan in the Russo-Japanese War, which had actually been the first time that a European power was beaten by an Asiatic power. Russia got humiliated in that war, and we're keeping this in mind. This isn't even almost 10 years later, roughly 10 years later after that. And Russia's going to war now with European nations. But just 10 years ago, they got their rear end handed to them by an Asian nation that they thought was inferior, despite the fact that, Japan had been much more modernized, partly due to the United States and Great Britain. But they kind of left that part out. But the Russian army is the only European army within the last 10 years that has really gone up against in a major war, and it proved to be the loser of that war. I mean, Russia didn't just lose on land. They lost their entire Baltic fleet in the Battle of Tsushima. So Russia's armies, although it has a 12 million strong army, there is the question, is the Russian army actually up to putting up a fight in a modern war, or is it simply just a big, decoy? Does it not really matter how large the Russian army is? Is its tactics and leadership up to the task of going to war and head to head with other European powers? Unfortunately, the answer to that question was no, it was not. Although Russia had quite the large army, it lacked sufficient military or political leadership. There was not clear directions coming from a certain high individual for a long time over what exactly should be done in terms of attack or battle plans or whatever else. Many commanders kind of operated on their own and were more seeking personal glory and pursuing their own vendettas than actually following the wishes of a high commander in most cases. And that is going to cripple Russia's war effort. So eventually, when Russia gets its army organized by about late August of 1914, they actually get it organized a little bit earlier than the Germans thought they would. Russia's first move is to, take the offensive. So we're going to move into East Prussia, which is in what is now Poland and even that real Russian enclave that they still have of Kaliningrad, because that used to be the East Prussian capital of Königsberg. But in August 1914, the Russian army moves into East Prussia, scares the crap out of the Germans, who are at this point learning that the war against France is not going to be quick, because at this point the Battle of the Marne is getting close. The Germans do not have that quick victory that they were hopefully pinning all their hopes for on that quick victory. That has not occurred. Germany can't send every force to the east to counter the Russian invasion like they had called for in their war plan. So this catches them off guard, surprisingly. But in a matter of just sheer brilliance, Germany ends up turning back the Russian invasion without that full army strength at the Battle of Tannenberg, which is, of course, led by the famous German generals of Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff, who end up turning back the Russians. And after the loss at Tannenberg, the Russians fully retreat from East Prussia. They retreat from this invasion of East Prussia. This is really the only, I think, major win early on in the war that Russia gained on the entire Eastern Front in World War One. Was this initial invasion of East Prussia, only to be turned back at Tannenberg. This was really the only offensive thing they really got to take at the very beginning of the war. I mean, you could argue a little bit in Austria-Hungary, but that's another matter. But all that Tannenberg manages to achieve, in any good sense, is it simply saves France at the Marne, because it forces the Germans to take some units that were going to go to France and act as these reserves, and forces them to send them east to counter the Russians. Now, the following 2 years were not very kind to the Russian Imperial Army at all. You had 19 and 15 were absolutely terrible, and the Russian army suffered just one defeat after another with crushing casualties and losses on each one. They lost their forces, they lost the Battle of Gorlice Tarnow, they lost a huge swath of their empire, really. In terms, they lost all of Russian Poland, they lost Galicia to the Austro-Hungarians, and they started to begin losing the Baltic states, which is the regions that now comprise of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. They started to lose the Baltic states as well, in addition to the Russian Poland that they had held since the late 1790s as a territory. In June of 1916, there is a small bright spot that occurs when General Alexei Brusilov tries to launch his Brusilov offensive, which at first actually works. It actually forces the Austro-Hungarian forces back, and it comes this close to destroying the Austro-Hungarian army and actually knocking Austro-Hungary out of the war. The Russians came this close to scoring perhaps what could have been the biggest win for the Allies in World War I, and might have even staved off the revolution had it succeeded. The problem came that when Austria, as always, when Austria started to fail, it called on its big buddy Germany to, hey, I'm failing right now. Could you send some backup? And Germany's reaction is, I really don't want to because I'm busy at Verdun right now, but I also can't let you fall either, so yeah, I'll send you some buddies. And it ends up turning the tide, and the Russians end up losing the Brusilov offensive. The other problem had been, again, the inadequacy of the Russian army, where Brusilov commanded that his fellow generals should support his offensive, should support his attack once it was starting to make headway, but instead of trying to support him, they simply ignored him or went on their own operations that had absolutely no impact on Brusilov's success. And that kind of spelled the doom of the Brusilov offensive. Now, all these losses from the war and these constant loss of territory, loss of men, in Russia and at home, there's no men in the factories, there's no men on the railways. Things start slowing down at home. Food production is down to absolute lows. People are starving. The Russian people never responded well to the war after it got underway, and they began to realize this wasn't going to be a quick war. This was going to be a drawn-out war of which we are not prepared for and are no way going to be able to endure forever. So this starts to form a distrust between the people who at this point in late 1916 are more than willing to kind of say, yeah, we don't want to fight the war anymore. And the government saying, oh no, we must fight. We must protect Russia. We must protect the Slavs. We must, coordinate with our allies. And the Russian people are saying, no more. Like, we've had our ass handed to us. Literally. We've had our literal ass handed to us at this point. We're losing on every front. We're losing territory. Call it quits now while we can get a deal. And the Russian people are just absolutely livid that the government is ignoring them because the government's autocratic. It's not going to listen to what the people want. The Tsar don't have to listen to what they want. He didn't listen after 1905. So it even grows into the people's concerns, even gets into the Duma, that sham parliamentary assembly that the Tsar allows to be formed in the wake of the 1905 revolution, even though he really makes sure that it has absolutely no political power whatsoever. It just has the faint sign that it does, the impression that it does. The Fourth Duma actually saw a progressive bloc actually form within it that proposed the creation of a new national coalition government that included the people with the Tsar and the monarchy, and a new program of reforms that would restore public confidence in the war effort. This was a good idea, except for one thing. Tsar Nicholas would actually have to share his power with the people, and there was under no circumstances was the Tsar going to allow that. So because of that, the Tsar Nicholas ended up rejecting that proposal, and he dismissed the Duma on September 3rd of 1915. This was during those 2 years. Now, the Tsar ended up in 1916, he ended up personally going to the front lines and taking direct command of the army because he felt that if he went in there and took personal command, maybe that would change things around. The problem was Nicholas was not a military man. He never fought a battle in his life. He didn't know that probably barely the first thing about military tactics, but yet somehow, because he's Tsar, he's going to be able to go in there and just, do better than what these generals have been doing, which didn't happen. And this ends up being another major problem because with the Tsar out on the front lines, who's in charge back home? Officially, Tsar Nicholas left his wife, the Empress Alexandra, he left her in charge back at home in the capital of St. Petersburg, or Petrograd as it's being called at that time because of anti-German sentiment. They've renamed the capital. So we'll call it Petrograd for this video, but just remember when we're talking about Petrograd, we're talking about St. Petersburg, and then when you go into the Soviets even renamed it Leningrad, and it's only really since the 90s it's gone back to St. Petersburg. But back home in Petrograd, in the capital, the Empress Alexandra is officially the one being left in charge of making sure everything runs smoothly at home, on the home front. Unfortunately, Alexandra is not well liked by the Russian people. She never has been, ever since she married the Tsar, because she was not Russian. She was actually from a German family, a German noble family, and thus, of course, when World War I breaks out, there are accusations thrown at her that, she's a German spy, she's working for the German government to destroy Russia's war effort. She was not a very popular figure at all. She was also the one that half the time was whispering these ideas to Nicholas about the briefest moment that Nicholas might consider, compromising with liberals or progressives and trying to establish a more workable government. She was the one that was constantly kind of whispering in his ear to, no, you're the Tsar, you need to do what you need to do, not what the people want you to do. They answer to you, not you answer to them. But what really ticks the people off with the situation of Alexandra being left in charge is she has a purported relationship with a certain infamous Russian holy man. Self-proclaimed holy man, I should say. He was more of a mystic. And many of us probably know him, and that is none other than the famous man of Father Grigory Rasputin, or just Rasputin as most people call him. Now, she was under Rasputin's influence, make no mistake. Grigory Rasputin, for those of you who are not familiar with him, and I'm going to probably just show people a picture of him now. This is Father Rasputin. Yes, he looks like a stunning figure. He was originally, I believe, a peasant out of Siberia, but he had had become somewhat of this religious mystic among the Russian masses, and eventually in the early to I think about the mid 1900s, he came into contact with the Russian royal family. Now, Rasputin gained influence with the Tsar and the Tsarina, or the Empress. I think we'll call her Tsarina, but he gained influence among them because of his inadvertent ability, it seemed, to heal the hemophiliac episodes of their son, Alexei. Now, Alexei is the youngest of the Tsar and Tsarina's children. He is the heir to the throne because a girl was not eligible normally by Russian law to inherit the throne. So Alexei, even though he was young as the children, he was Tsarevich. He was going to be the next Tsar. Unfortunately, he was born with hemophilia, which is a disease that prevents one's blood from clotting. So even a small bruise could actually be fatal to a hemophiliac like Alexei, and there were instances where he had severe internal bleeding that they just couldn't get to stop. Now, for some odd reason, Rasputin seemed on multiple instances of this happening, he was able to actually somehow make the bleeding stop, supposedly. How he would have done that, we don't know. But Rasputin gains this reputation as kind of a mystic. He is the kind of holy healer to the royal family, and he also becomes somewhat of an advisor to them on certain matters. The Tsar and Tsarina grow to trust Rasputin so much that they end up asking him for advice on political matters, domestic matters, almost anything that they think they can get an opinion of him from. So this goes on a very sour route real fast because it would be okay if Rasputin was a more of a decent-minded man. The unfortunate thing is, this man has a reputation among the Russian masses for not only being a mystic and a self-proclaimed holy man, but he's kind of a womanizer. He is more than willing to shack up with a couple women and have an affair or two under other people's noses, and he was not afraid to engage in certain kinds of actions in front of people. He definitely was not a well-liked figure, especially among the more common Russian people. The nobles really didn't have that much of an issue with him because they were usually the ones engaging with him. Unfortunately, because of Rasputin's reputation, unfortunately, even though the nobles are going to, of course, have no issue with him, at least their wives aren't. I can't say the same for the husbands. But the popular Russian people are not that much in favor of Rasputin, and the Tsarevich's hemophilia is actually never made public to the Russian people at large at the time that he has it, so they don't even know why Rasputin is even there. Now, had they been a little bit more, you know, transparent with that matter, I think maybe public opinion might have been a little different, but I don't know if it would have been massively. But Rasputin, because of he has this influence over the Russian royal family, there are accusations and worries that while the Tsar is out on the front commanding the troops, that Rasputin is really the one pulling the strings of the Russian government because he has this influence over the Tsarina. There were actually a couple times that Nicholas was going to dismiss him at the behest of his ministers who advised him to do so, but when he went to go do it, it was his wife who prevented him from doing it. She was diehard, would not, have Rasputin leave her side. And so there are these accusations that Rasputin is kind of this evil influence in the government, trying to seek out his own personal, selfish needs over the needs of the nation, and that he is the one actually calling the shots and influencing the Tsar and his wife. So, and there's also, of course, the whole argument that Rasputin is having sexual relations and an affair with the Tsarina herself, which we don't have any direct evidence that happened, but that was a common rumor at the time. So you have the public who believes that the Tsars are being puppets at this point of a Russian mystic slash, sexual predator, that you have growing economic hardship in Russia due to the war. The men are not home. The factories are not up to full production. Food production's down. There's all kinds of things there. Massive casualties at the front and loss of territories, retreat of armies, and the government being led by incompetent officials who do not have any idea what they're doing or how to conduct government in any way that is actual effective. So, and then ultimately, in the case of Rasputin, a group of Russian nobles, actually, who are related to the Tsar, actually take the matter in their own hands. They see this boiling discontent that is growing in Russia in 1916, and they realize, okay, we got to do something because the Tsars aren't going to do something, and we're already seeing this is getting bad enough at home that if this gets much higher, we could be looking at a revolution or revolt on our hands. So they argue Rasputin seems to be one of the major complaints of the people right now. We don't like him either, so let's do the best option we can. Let's assassinate him and get rid of him out of the Tsar's influence. So on December 29th of 1916, Rasputin actually ends up being assassinated by a group of conservative nobles out of the hope that doing so would kind of quell the public's appetite for for discontent at the time and kind of quell their attitude down. Unfortunately, that does not happen. At this point, it's actually kind of already too late. And that will bring us up to roughly the events of the February Revolution. And this is going to start on February 23rd, if you're going by the old Julian calendar. If you're going by the modern Gregorian calendar, then we're looking at about March 8th of 1917. This is when the revolution is going to begin. This revolution, however, you got to keep in mind this was not a planned effort from the start. This revolution was not organized or even recognized at first by any of the various existing political groups. It kind of came about by the common people. It was a sudden revolution that at first no one really took it as anything major. They just thought, oh, the people are revolting. I mean, they're striking. That's normal. And it rapidly escalated into something that quickly blew everyone's minds away, and quickly the political groups who were eventually going to have to help form a provisional government. Part of the reason why they were so ineffective was because they were caught off guard by this too. So when the revolution comes about and kind of forces the Tsar's abdication, the provisional government is now led by a group of people who had not even been prepared to take over the affairs of the Russian government. They were not prepared in any form to take over because they were caught completely off guard that this even happened and are now rushing to have to embrace it and help it along. But it's going to begin February 23rd, 1917, and it's going to begin in Petrograd, in the capital, in the capital, Petrograd, St. Petersburg. And this is going to start with strikes in several of the Petrograd factories that were already a daily occurrence. Strikes had been happening throughout the war by many of the factory's laborers, mostly over wages, and, they weren't getting paid their full money because, of course, some of the factory workers were private owners and weren't going to pay that much. Others, they just didn't have that, they weren't selling enough product to really give it out to their employees at times due to the war effort. Now, on this day, on February 23rd, there were no fewer than probably 130,000 picketers on that day that were striking from the factories. It was at least 130,000. That's a pretty big number for the capital to have. And it wasn't just them either, because we had female workers. They end up joining with the strikers because they're celebrating International Women's Day. So you have this group of strikers from the factories who are now being joined by common women who are, at home trying to take care of their children and their families, and now they're out in the streets. Now, despite the large size of the mob that comes about at this time on February 23rd of 1917, and although they had a couple attacks on certain local businesses or government buildings, the government leaders didn't give too much attention to the strikers. Why? Because this had happened before. This was not uncommon. Yes, it was a big crowd, but we've had strikers before. We've had this happen before. This isn't something that's unheard of in Russia. So they didn't think nothing was going to come out of it. Now, the only precaution that they ended up taking on the first day was to prevent the protesters from reaching the very center of the city, so they ended up putting troops in near the city center to kind of guard and patrol the streets to kind of keep the mob back and keep them away from, the Winter Palace and all that. Now, on February 24th, the strikers grew much more numerous. They grew in size within 24 hours. At this point, it is 30% of all the workers in Petrograd, not just the 130,000 anymore. It's 30% of all workers. Almost half of the city's workers are now picketing and protesting in the street. Some managed to reach the city center this day, And at this point, even some university students end up joining in at this point from the colleges and universities that are in the city. Now, the protesters primarily were concerned at this point with food shortages. They didn't have food. They didn't have, enough to eat for most of the war. Rations were getting short. They couldn't, anything that they grew, they couldn't barely keep because they had to be given away to the army. So the common Russian people have decided at this point, we're protesting because we're hungry. We're starving. We can't even get bread. So at this point, it's food shortages. Few of them are even denouncing the idea of, the Russian autocracy and ending the war. Few of them at first are even going on that prospect. The turning point of the revolution is going to come on February 25th, or here in the United States, it was March 10th, as the strike became much more general. And at this point, the strikers get aggressive. This is where they actually start attacking police stations, they start attacking government buildings, and they ended up raiding the police stations. They're disarming any police officers that they can get a hold of. At this point, they're actually getting quite violent. I think we have a few images here I'm going to show at this point. So, kind of recap. This is the Eastern Front of World War One, about 1917. This is, it shows also what's going to happen in the summer a little bit, but I'm going to point some things out here. So, this line right here that I have kind of outlined in pen, this was the pre-war border of the Russian Empire. This was the pre-war border, 1914 and before. So, this is where Poland is now. It's split between Russia, Germany, and Austria-Hungary. All this is Poland. This is Russian Poland. Russia actually had a capital of what is now Warsaw. By 1917, this is the front line by the spring. So all this up here that was Russian land, they've lost. They've been pushed back this far. Now, they've not really been pushed back too far from Austria-Hungary. They're pretty close. In fact, I think they've gained a little bit here because, of course, the Austrians weren't really that strong. The main threat here was the Germans. In St. Petersburg, I believe, it is on here. It's way up here. Up here's the capital of Petrograd slash St. Petersburg. The front line is getting closer. And then here's the Baltic states. This is the military situation that's causing the people to somewhat revolt. Now, this is a group on, I believe, February 20... I could be wrong here. But this was about February 25th. This is a crowd in one of the Petrograd districts of growing protesters. And, this is not 130,000, I don't think, but this is quite a few when you can see them lying down the streets. This was about February 25th. Mind you, the Tsar is not in the capital when this breaks out. He is at the front lines. His wife and his children are, but not him. Now, when the protesters decide now that we're going to attack, government buildings, that we're going to start attacking and disarming the police stations and raiding them for, weapons and supplies, that is when the military actually gets called in. Now, the military Cossack cavalry is already patrolling the streets of Petrograd by order of the mayor of the city is already ordering that, okay, we need to have military units on patrol here because this crowd's getting a little bit unruly. The turning point comes on February 25th because of one event, and that is the event that the military, who in 1905 had refused to join the protesters and had stayed by the Tsar's side, and that was a big reason why the 1905 revolution didn't succeed, was because although the people were for it, the army was not convinced yet. On this day in 1917, February 25th, some of those military units that are supposed to be patrolling the capital city center and keeping it free of protesters end up conversing. First, they converse with the protesters, and then they become friendly with them, and many of them actually end up joining the protesters. So now the military is joining the mob at this point. The military is fed up with this. The Tsar, upon hearing that some of these military men at first are going and joining with the protesters, he orders the military governor of Petrograd, Sergei Kabalov, to suppress the strike with military force. He orders that, okay, this worked in 1905. We just fired on the protesters. They'll disperse if we do that again. So he orders the military governor, Kabalov, yeah, go ahead and fire a couple rounds into the crowd and see how they like that. So the Tsar empowers. At the same time, he also views that the people are getting unruly, so he decides, okay, there's a session of the Duma, and the Duma is in session right now, the people's parliament that they wanted me to give them. So I'm going to empower my prime minister, Nikolai Golitsyn. He is going to discontinue the Duma's current session until this is ended. And on February 26, Kabalov tried to disperse the demonstrators by force. He employed the cadets from the Imperial Guard and the police to fire on the crowd, and the demonstrators temporarily scattered, and many ended up getting shot down in the chaos. Although, unfortunately for the Tsar, this didn't work this time. In 1905, when the troops had fired into the crowd, that was enough to break up the mob. It was not enough in 1917, because although the crowd did briefly scatter and panic, they very quickly got right back together, and this time actually started trading shots in some instances with the military in the capital. It actually failed to crush that mob, and it only enraged them and made them more angry that they seen that, okay, so the Tsar thinks he's just going to get rid of us instead of communicating with us like in 1905. So guess what? We're going to get worse. So, in the day that followed, on February 27th, Kabalov lost entire control of the city. The military governor now has lost control of the capital. The capital city is now in the hands of revolutionaries. The Tsar's family is in the capital. He's, of course, worried to death. And the local regiments and troops and guards end up joining the strikers in absolute mutiny. So, there's not hardly a loyal military unit left in the capital. Tsar Nicholas is at the front. He's getting these telegrams, or whatever you want to call them. He's getting these messages from the home front. Capital is lost. Winter Palace under siege by protesters. He's worried for his family's sake. He's worried for his country's sake, because this is my capital and now revolutionaries are in control. So he decides, you know what, I'm going to start sending troops. So this is February 27th. The ministers end up being that are in the city that are still the last bit of royal authority in the capital other than the royal family. They end up being cornered at the Admiralty building and are arrested on February 27th. And this, of course, has come about because the army has switched sides in the capital. Now, when Tsar Nicholas is going to send troops now, because now he realizes, okay, this is a complete mutiny. I need to send loyal units from the front back to Petrograd to crush this rebellion. So he decides, all right, we're going to send a couple units. At the same time, the Duma leaders, who were under pressure from the revolutionaries who are now in control of the city, they actually are trying to mediate with the Tsar. They're trying to contact him to try to convince him to compromise with the protesters, saying, if you come in here with a bunch of troops, you're going to have a massacre on your hands, a slaughter, and that's not going to work, because we just seen what that did when you sent the troops to disperse the crowd, and it just made them angry and more violent. They're warning the Tsar, you must compromise with these people. You cannot be a brute. Nicholas refuses this. He's blind to the facts. He thinks it's just a couple of, treacherous, treasonous individuals that are stirring up the mob. He doesn't think this is the common sentiment of the mob. He thinks that, oh no, they love the Tsar. They love me. They love my family. They would never want to get rid of me. It's just a couple of agitators that are stirring them up and, egging them on. That's not the case here. It is a common people uprising. Even the military is not with him, and Nicholas is just blatantly ignoring the facts at this point that are being presented to him about the capital is completely lost, and no one is rushing to come back to you. When the Tsar learns that, to put it bluntly, the troops never get to the capital that he sends many on railway trains, and the revolutionaries are making contact with those outside of the capital, and they end up having revolutionaries on the tracks in control of the train lines who are going to bring these troops in, and they end up stopping these convoys of military units from even getting into the capital or to it, way before they even get close. So it ends Nicholas's little plan to, let's just go ahead here and quash this little rebellion with military force. That's not going to work at this point, because now you can't even get your troops in the capital. The capital is closed off to you. So this is going to bring us to the establishment of a provisional government at this point, because the Duma, someone needs to take charge in the capital. It's the seat of the Russian Empire, the seat of government. Now, due to the hesitation of the Duma members to take the role of a leadership for the revolution, many of the workers who had been kind of the instigators of this common uprising, they decide we're going to take immediate steps to organize revolutionary forces into something for this revolution, because the Duma members literally were more than willing to take orders from the Tsar, and only now are even moving and scrambling to try to see what they can do to establish some sort of normalcy here. So they end up forming their own organization that they entitle the Petrograd Soviet of Workers and Soldiers Deputies. This was a common workers that set this up. On February 28th, the Duma finally decided to constitute a government. Now, the Duma hoped that they could stave off further anarchy in the city, and that they might even be able to save the monarchy. That by forming a provisional government, the people would kind of relax a little bit. Let's calm down. Let's work this out. And this is headed by even a royal family member, Prince Lvov, as prime minister of the provisional government. Now, the Petrograd Soviet, opened its first session a day earlier on the 27th with 250 members. They are socialist deputies of the Duma who do not agree with the rest of the Duma. They are also prominent worker leaders and members of strike committees. Now, the problem that's going to come about here is you have the Duma, the People's Parliament, supposedly, they're forming a provisional government, yes. But just a day before, you have this Petrograd Soviet that was declared by common workers and their deputies by saying, okay, we're forming a provisional government. So the problem here is you have two different bodies trying to establish a provisional government and establish legitimacy as the ruling governing body of Russia right now, while this chaos has engulfed the capital. Now, at this first meeting of the Petrograd Soviet, there was, despite a little bit of chaos, they did appoint a strong executive committee to secure food supplies and strategic defense weapons for Petrograd in case the Tsar's troops ended up getting into the city. Now, they also decided they were going to change their own personal constitution by including army deputies and workers' deputies to try to include the military, who's been crucial in getting this, revolt to succeed. So they want to make sure that they're included in the decisions of this so-called, Soviet government that's being set up. They are going to be the depository of real power they want to be the depository of real power. They don't have it yet. And they're going to initially not oppose the Duma forming government, because they're like, okay, we have members of the Duma in here, so if they want to make a sham government, let them, because some of our members are on it. So, unfortunately, this Soviet is going to become a thorn after the March of Revolution. We're going to see that in the next video, because they're going to be a major instigator in the Bolsheviks, because at this point, the Bolsheviks are present in the Petrograd Soviet, the communists, but they're not a majority. They are a minority at this point. So that brings us to the big culmination here of February 1917 of the big event that's going to occur, and that is the Tsar. How does the Tsar lose his throne, ultimately? Because as we just discussed, although the Duma is working on forming a provisional government, they aren't initially, flying to get rid of the monarchy at first. As the two try to negotiate with each other, with the Petrograd Soviet negotiating with the Duma over who was going to have what authority and whatever else, the question comes up of, okay, so we're going to form a provisional government. What are we doing with the Tsar and the Russian royal family? They absolutely agreed. Nicholas can no longer be an autocrat. That has somewhat brought this nation to the brink of destruction. We're fighting with each other over it. So the Tsar being an autocrat and absolute ruler, that's out the window at this point. That is not an option. That's got to change. Conservative Duma members, although they are willing to get rid of the autocratic rule, the autocracy, they're not willing to get rid of the entire monarchy outright because it's the only thing they have, and they want to see the republic. They want to see the monarchy preserved. But on top of that, these nobles fear an actual democratic republic taking its place. They fear that, in a republic, I'm not going to be special. I'm not a noble anymore. I'm just a common person like anybody else. So these more conservative nobles are against, getting rid of the monarchy and forming a democratic republic in its place for Russia because they fear of losing their status. Now, the Duma ended up sending members Alexander Guchkov and Vasily Shulgin to meet the Tsar at his HQ, which was on a train that was outside of the capital. That was a little bit away from the capital, but it was kind of his headquarters for this whole operation. Their mission that they were initially sent to do was to basically demand, okay, the Tsar is so unpopular here at home that we don't have a choice. He's got to go. But they decide we are willing to preserve the monarchy. So the deal that they're going to offer Nicholas at this stage is saying there under no circumstances are the people in Petrograd going to accept you as Tsar anymore. You are going to have to abdicate. Your reign has brought us to this point. Mind you, your family is still in the capital and could be possibly hurt if you refuse that by the common people. The government's not saying that we're going to do that, but they are warning him that we cannot speak for what the mob will do if you refuse. So they send this mission to the Tsar under the demand that, okay, we'll preserve the monarchy under the condition that you will abdicate. In your place, we will name your son, the Tsarevich, Alexei, the young hemophiliac boy, we will name him Tsar. He will take your place as your successor. However, since Alexei is not even, I'm trying to think of how old he was at this point. Right, so he would have been, Alexei is only 12, I believe, at this point in age. Since he's still a kid, he obviously can't rule on his own, not especially right now. We got a war ongoing. So they decide, we'll name your son, you'll abdicate, your son will be czar, but until he's of age, until he's 18, your younger brother, Grand Duke Michael, who's the czar's younger brother, he will act as regent for your son and kind of, officially kind of control things at least until Alexei is old enough. This is the offer they send Nicholas. But, of course, they make it more than clear to Nicholas we're still uncertain if the people will accept, if they will accept you not abdicating. We don't think that they're going to accept that. We know that they won't. But they also make it more than clear. We cannot guarantee the people will accept this deal either. We're willing to accept it, but we don't know if the people are going to be interested in saving the monarchy. Nicholas, for once, is faced with brutal reality. He's going to lose his throne. The question is, do I let my son have it? He's worried for his son because his son is a hemophiliac, and the common Russian people don't know about that. He's worried about his family. And Nicholas ponders it a little bit on his train. He fights back a little bit, arguing, I'm your God appointed ruler. Well, the Duma members, the representatives are like, well, you can claim that all you want, but try telling that to the people right now. So eventually, Nicholas concedes and he agrees to abdicate. He will give up his throne. However, he does not adhere to the plan of naming his son as his successor. He argues that he is worried for his son's safety. He's worried about losing his son if he were to name him Tsar due to the current political environment. So he argues, I will abdicate for myself and for my son from the throne. Neither of us will take the throne, and instead jumps right to the conclusion that since I'm abdicating for myself and my son, I will name my younger brother Michael not as regent, but as my direct successor, as Tsar. So Michael, the younger brother of the Tsar, is, according to the Tsar, according to the abdication document that he ends up signing, he names Michael as his heir, as his successor. Within a day, this solution was abandoned. So this would have been, I believe, March March 1st/15th if you're here in the United States, but it was March 1st in Russia. The Tsar officially abdicated, and by March 2nd, March 16th, the Russian monarchy was officially at an end because, unfortunately for the Tsar, his younger brother Michael had absolutely no intention of wanting to, you know, Michael didn't have that much intention to want to rule on his own. He never had any desire to. He was the youngest of all the children of the Tsar's siblings, so he really never expected to even come up to that point. And the Duma urged Michael, when they got word that the Tsar had named him as his successor, they urged Michael to refuse the throne until a new constitution could be drawn by the Constituent Assembly. Michael ultimately decides, I'm not really interested anyway. So he ends up refusing the throne, which ends over 300 years of imperial Russian Romanov rule in Russia, of the Romanov dynasty, had ruled Russia for 300 years since the 1600s, and now that's at an end. The Russian monarchy comes to an end with that revolution. Now, the Tsar, in the following days after his abdication, he requested that the new ministers in the provisional government arrange passage for him and his family to Great Britain. The Tsar says, me and my family are in danger here. I'm no longer your Tsar. I don't want to be in Russia anymore. I'm trying to leave. At first, the provisional government was actually, they were looking to actually provide Nicholas and his family with this transport, because at this point, they just want Nicholas out of the picture. They just want him gone. He was a problem as long as he was in Russia. He was a problem in their eyes. So they said, you know what? If he wants to get out of here and leave us to handle the situation, fine. He's no longer Tsar. We'll give him all the transport he needs just to get him out of the picture. Unfortunately, the Petrograd Soviet is a lot more antagonistic to the Russian royal family for the autocratic rule that Nicholas had used all these years, and they want justice for the people. So they discovered this plan by accident, and they end up calling on the provisional government to place the royal family under arrest. Do not let them go and escape to Great Britain, because you'll never get them back. If you're going to try them for crimes, you need to place them under arrest now. Now, the Soviet gave orders to railway operators to stop the imperial train, to not let it proceed any further until the provisional government would actually respond. And the railway workers who were loyal to the Soviet actually correspond with this order, and they end up stopping the train. And the Soviet sends a detachment of armed workers to that train to arrest the Tsar before the provisional government has even given a response. So this is technically in defiance of the government, which is only going to cause more tension with the provisional government and the Petrograd Soviet. The provisional government eventually concedes that if the people are now starting to riot again over the idea of the Tsar not being tried or arrested for crimes that he may have perpetrated against Russia and against the common people, so they eventually concede and say, okay, we're going to have to arrest him. So the provisional government, just a few days after Nicholas abdicates, they end up conceding and they arrest the former imperial family and place them under house arrest. They don't put him in a jail, but they let Nicholas go back to the palace and just kind of be kept under armed guard. But that brings an end to the first video covering the Russian Revolution, and that is the February Revolution of 1917. And I think we might have, right here is a picture. I think we have two more I'm going to show you. Or three more. Oh, we had a couple. But this is a picture of some protesters in Petrograd burning and destroying monarchist symbols in a big old burn pile. Where at this point, the popular opinion has turned against the Russian royal family, and they're just utterly trying to destroy any imperial visages in the capital. Here we actually have the Russian royal imperial family. We have the Tsar here, Nicholas. We have his wife up here, Alexandra. And then we have their four daughters. Trying to think. I don't remember which one's who here, except for this one. This is Anastasia, or Anastasia, however you want to say her. You had also Maria, Olga, and Tatiana. And then right here is the heir to the throne that has hemophilia, and that is Alexei. Which, unfortunately, are going to meet a very sad end here before too long, but we'll discuss that in one of our other videos here. This is a painting of the moment that the Tsar is signing his abdication document on the imperial royal train, because no photographs, of course, were taken of that moment, but this is based on eyewitness accounts. And then these are the leaders of Russia's new provisional government that is set up by the Duma in the wake of revolution beginning in Petrograd. Which this man right here in the middle, Alexander Kerensky, we're going to see a lot more of him here very soon. But for the purpose of this video, that will conclude the February-March 1917 revolution, which is the opening phase of the Russian Revolution, which means, okay, Russia no longer has a monarchy. Now where do we go from here? Because Russia's got a pressing problem on its hands. We got two competing bodies competing for governmental power. Is Russia going to become this republic? How do we get that there? And at the same time, we still have a war going on. Do you think Austria and Germany are just going to stop because we're in the middle of a revolution? No, they're going to take advantage of that. So do we pursue the war or do we sue for peace? And that's going to come up in our next video. So that will, I believe, be next week. If I really get into it this week, I might have it later in the week, but I'm not counting on that. But it will definitely be out by next week for the week of Thanksgiving. And we'll proceed from there. So again, as usual, any questions, any comments, added information even, or suggestions, be sure to leave that in the comment section. Be more than happy to go through them. Anyone that, of course, the sad thing is, Russia has been in chaos since 1917, really. I mean, we've been it's had an antagonistic relationship with the world ever since, in most cases. That is one of the sad things about this. But yeah, I think that will conclude it for today. So again, all the comment stuff, if you want to go back and look at the one video I did on the 1905 revolution, I think it was like second video I ever did, so it's pretty early on. It might not be as detailed as I do them now, but I have to go back there and see. But yeah, that is definitely in our library. I'll try to put a link to that at the end of this video. That way people can go back and look at it and maybe get a heads up of how that one went. So that will, I think, conclude us for this week. So next week we will be back covering, hopefully, the second half. So that's going to be the summer of 1917, and hopefully we'll get to the Bolshevik Revolution in that video, if we can maintain it on 3. So that is the game plan for right now. So hopefully everyone has a good rest of their week, and we'll see you all back here next week for our next video on the Russian Revolution, on the continuing chaos that is rapidly developing in Russia at this time.